we're moving into what I think is the more interesting part of the semester, which is we're no longer going to talk about what good reasoning looks like. We're going to really go through and look at bad reasoning. And some of these are going to be interesting facts about human beings and sorts of mistakes you can catch yourself making. And I just think the stuff is much more engaging because you'll think of examples from your own practical life, and it'll just be a more interesting experience for everyone, hopefully. I mean, I find it more exciting. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm in the same boat as all of you. All these little charts and things, they don't really, tickle my fancy. I think they're important and they can be made more interesting than they otherwise would be, but they're not the most exciting thing in the world. But I do want to finish off with the homework, just talking about it. So first off, I'm a whole really happy with how the homeworks went. Just about everybody did. I think most of the grades were in the A range, and I graded them pretty loosely because just about everyone did a good job of nobody made too many catastrophic mistakes. Just about everyone identified the conclusion in each argument. And then you did a pretty good job on the charts of making sure that what was under one general or one major premise, all the things that were on one topic went together. People messed up the ordering, and some of them were really easy mistakes to make. Others, you maybe had one premise that was on the wrong side, but generally everyone kept it pretty well organized, which showed that you all understood the general ideas. And if there were a few arguments here and there that were tough to get the precise ordering, that's really a minor issue in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, on the whole, I was thrilled with how it went. And it shows that when a professor actually does something competent, it makes a difference. So I'm glad that my second explanation and adding the pictures, you should have seen the leftovers from it. It was like 17 blank white pieces of paper with Sharpie written on them. And it was fun. But anyway, so I just want to go over this. Any questions thus far? All right, so number one, the correct answer was 3. The correct answer was that these were 2 linked premises. Just about, I'd say most people got this one right. A few people said 1 and a few people said 2, but a lot of the people that said those answers still gave me an explanation that suggested they knew it was a linked premise. And so I just, took off a couple points for you choosing the wrong picture, but just about everyone. And the reason these were linked is you can't conclude that this person has a crush on Mark unless you put A and B together. If you just know that they dislike Matthew, that only shows you that they don't have a crush on Matthew. They could still have a crush on Luke or John or anybody else in the world. And if you just know that they have a crush on Mark or Luke, or Mark or Matthew, then you don't know which one they have the crush on. So it's only together that you get the final conclusion. So that's why it was linked. Number 2, the vast majority of people got this one right. It was 4 in the correct answer. The one I was going for was 4, but I also gave it to people for 3 if they put the correct explanation. So some people interpreted this. The way I was thinking of it is there were 2 main reasons I really screwed up. The 2 main reasons were 1, some of the material I didn't teach, and 2, the instructions were really confusing. And then one of the evidence that the instructions were confusing is this example of something which made no sense. But other people pointed out that what you could take it as is the reason I really messed up is the only reason was the instructions were confusing. And then both the example and the fact I didn't teach something were proof that the instructions were confusing. So I took either 3 or 4 with a good explanation. Number 5, number 3, 4, and 5, I'm not gonna go over. I could put the correct answers in most of the homeworks and they're up here now. I just wanna highlight a few things and why the most common mistakes were people switching around 1 and 2 in this one, and then very close switch arounds, and people switch around D and G in number 3. So they had 5 and 6 switched, or was it? No, they had 5 and 7 switched. Now, these were all really, in the grand scheme of things, minor issues, and that's why if you made those little mistakes, you only lost like a point or 2. And really the reason that these ones were tough is really I want to use this as kind of a sidetrack teaching moment of explaining what the degree to which things can be subtle and confusing, and the reason that I think it seemed like it could go in either direction, but in truth, there was a particular direction it could go. And one other thing to highlight quickly, the reason these say 4/5 or 4/5/6, when you have linked premises like that, it doesn't matter what order they go in. So it could go 4/5/6 or 5/4/6. As long as you had those three and those three spots, it didn't matter which order you had them in. Now, the common mistakes, as I said, people made is just one thing went in an order of another. And I think one of the major things that came up that's worth highlighting is that, unfortunately, there's a lot of sentences that look similar, but are subtly different in what makes them true or false. And so very often, unless you like really crank it down, it can be difficult to tell the difference between what somebody's thinking, what order they thought, and what was going on in their head when they chose to say something versus why you, as somebody seeing this argument, should believe the truth of it. So what I have here is here's 4 sentences that are very similar in a lot of ways. We have Trump will reduce crime. Trump said that Trump will reduce crime. Trump believes that Trump will reduce crime. Trump's goal is that Trump will reduce crime. Now, all of these are clearly related to each other in important ways. They all have to do with Trump reducing crime. The tough thing is that these 4 sentences are also very importantly different, and what makes them all true is a different thing. And because of that, they can play different roles in an argument. So for instance, what makes it, these are all things that could be true or false. They're all just declarative sentences. What would it take for sentence 1 to be true? Trump will reduce crime. What does it take to make that true?
Evidence to how he plans to reduce crime.
But even more than that, so you just gave me what a really good, thoughtful answer is. I'm looking for the dumb answer of what makes it, say it turns out that this was false. What does that mean? What does it mean for this to be false? What things would have to happen in the world to make one false?
More crime would happen.
More crime would happen. So this first one is about the world and Trump's place in it and the crimes in it. Now, number 2, what does it mean to say that Trump said that Trump will reduce crime? What makes this one true? Now, again, it's got the same part in it, Trump will reduce crime. But what makes number 2 true? What does it take for it to be true that Trump said that Trump will reduce crime?
He has to say it.
All he has to do is say it. For 2 to be true, Trump doesn't actually have to reduce crime. There's nothing about this. He could even be lying through his teeth. He could have no intention to reduce crime.
He is.
Pardon?
I was just making a Trump joke. Nothing.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I heard it. Yeah. It seems like odds are, if he's saying this and knowing Trump, it's odds are that he might not even be thinking about this when he says it. It's just the words come out of his mouth. So this first one is about the world. The second one is about words. What about the third one? What does it take for it to be true that Trump believes that Trump will reduce crime? Where should we look for the truth of this one? Should we look in his words? What's the most like direct way of figuring it out? I mean, this is a tough one because it's tough to actually figure out these, but what are the ones that, where would you look? Where in the universe would you look to see if this one's true? It's a scary, scary place that I don't think any of us want to explore too closely. It's under a big mop of orangish hair. Where do Trump's beliefs live?
In his head.
Yeah, in his head. So this is a statement about Trump's head. And so in a certain way is this last one, Trump's goal or Trump's aim. That's also something about Trump's head. So all of these are closely related, but they play very important different roles in an argument. So in these arguments, a lot of what happened, I think, was people were giving explanations for why Trump believed a certain thing or why he said something. So if we go back to number 3, a very common thing, the correct order was that Trump is going to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. And the justification, the reason that you should believe that Trump is going to do this is that Trump is his plan, or he's going to make new trade deals. The new trade deals are the explanation or the additional information that prove or are designed to prove that he's going to bring jobs back. Now, if you were thinking about it from inside Trump's head, you might think about it in reverse, where Trump is thinking, I'm going to strike up new trade deals. Why am I going to strike up new trade deals? Well, my goal is to bring back manufacturing. So from inside Trump's head, if you're thinking about his train of thought, it seems like the order should be that I'm going to bring, you'd think that it would, the conclusion or the thing that he's going for is that I'm going to, or I have the goal to bring back or make new trade deals. Why? Well, because I want to bring back manufacturing jobs. But that's a question about what's going on in Trump's head. Our question is, why should I believe that Trump is going to make America great again? Well, I believe, fact of the matter, he's going to bring back manufacturing jobs. And what's my evidence for that? Well, one evidence might be something like Trump said he will make new trade deals, or Trump will make new trade deals. But there's a difference there between getting clear about what someone said, what's going on in their head, and what they're actually doing. And so this is just kind of a highlight to really, this is an important thing to keep in your mind, just about the way that we talk and the way, and unfortunately, this is the sort of thing that is like very prominent in English, but other languages worldwide, it's got different syntax, it's got subtle differences. So some of this stuff, and part of the reason that I didn't take off any points on this is because part of the reason that we have trouble with this is I think, you know, this is CUNY, it's great. Not everyone is an English language first language speaker. So therefore, we're gonna have times in which like understanding these subtle differences is like, you know, if you were to ask me to first learn, say Mandarin, and then try to learn these complex distinctions, I would probably never be very good at them. So I'm never gonna, I don't want to take off people for not speaking the language that we just so happen to speak here because a bunch of British people in the, you know, 1700s had bigger guns than the Native Americans did. But yeah, this is the idea, is why, what was going on in some of these ones is keep in mind the ways in which you have to distinguish between what's going on inside a head, what's coming out of someone's mouth, and what the world's actually like. So that's a lot of these little confusions were tied in with that one main point. Any questions on this? If you didn't follow this, like that is totally okay. This was more just a topic which I find super interesting and I think is like a good thing to keep in mind, and trying to remember that there's a difference between what is happening and what someone says is happening and what someone believes is happening. And just because someone believes it doesn't mean it's true. Just because it's true doesn't mean someone believes it. So just teasing all of that out can be really useful and important when thinking about, you know, how this stuff works in our everyday lives. Any questions, comments, concerns? Oh, one other business point, you do not have a homework this weekend because it's a Thursday. So yay, no homework until like next week. It'll just be a whole week on fallacies, but there, as I said, it's going to be much easier. You're never going to have to see those silly charts again. So be happy, I guess, unless you really want to. You can like draw some on your own. But anyway, all right. So that was the homework. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Our huge, massive group of folks we have this week. All right. So I'm going to erase this, and now I'm just going to write up. We're just basically today going to talk about 5 different ways to reason crappy, or mistakes you can make, all of which I know I have committed all of them in my life, and I'm sure all of you have. And the goal here is just to know what sort of mistakes people can make, just so all of these are also very tricky. So very often using these sorts of approaches are ways of trying to convince someone your argument is good when it's not. So what we're going to do now is transition from, we've talked about understanding how reasons fit together in premises and conclusions. Now we're just going to concentrate on particular sorts of arguments someone might give and why, even though they're appealing to us, they're very often not good and can lead us to bad conclusions that we end up doing things we wouldn't have wanted to do. So let me just erase these. First off, our big word of the day is What's number 3? 3 is 4 is false. Lemma. 5 is So, these are the 5 types of bad reason. So first off, the fancy term is fallacy. All a fallacy means is a mistake in reasoning. And what it is to make a mistake in reasoning is to think about things in a way that even if you start with true premises, you're not going to get to a true conclusion. So you could begin with all true facts that everyone accepts, except even so, you're still going to end up with a bad or false conclusion, something you don't want to end up accepting. It's basically, if you follow these ways, what you can end up doing is missing the overall point. And all of these sorts of mistakes, and there's millions of ways for an argument to be wrong because all of these can be combined together and everything else. It's just these are some of the popular ways you're going to run into. And what I want to highlight is that each one of these is often related to a very normal way of reasoning or something which is a genuine thing to bring up. So certain of these things, like an ad hominem argument, is related to calling someone's credentials into question, which is a good thing to do when you're arguing. But trying to prove that your point is a certain way in any of these ways as is are not good. So basically, you've got some conclusion you want to argue. I mean, we have a classic example of this on whatever night that was, Monday night, Tuesday night, whenever the two fellows happened to get on a stage and yell at each other. That was just full of all sorts of these different sorts of fallacies, because they were essentially up there. What a debate is just a long-winded argument between two people. An argument in the philosophical sense of there's a conclusion they want you to draw, although it also devolves very often into the other type in which there's old men yelling at each other. Their conclusion was, one of them was vote for Trump. The other one's conclusion was vote for Biden. And along the way, they committed all sorts of good reasons and a lot of bad ones. So let's just talk about what some of these bad ways of reasoning are. So the first one is an appeal to authority. When you appeal to an authority, what does that mean? You're trying to reach your conclusion. So here's your conclusion. And you've got a reason that supports the conclusion, a reason or a premise. In an appeal to authority, what is your reason or your premise? What are you saying? Give me an example of an appeal to authority.
Like basically you're saying, according to this author, this is a fact or something like that.
Exactly. It's just, instead of saying I saw it with my own eyes or I believe it because I calculated it myself, you just say something like, well, it's true because so-and-so said so. Or what is your evidence for it? I believe that the earth is flat. Why? My mother said so. Or I believe the earth is round. Why? Because my science teacher in 5th grade said so. I believe that Trump is going to win the election. Why? Trump said so. All of these are appeals to authority. Now, why is it that an appeal to authority is not a good way of going about an argument? What is the issue with appealing to authorities? Now, to be clear, to tell the difference between an appeal to authority and why it's bad, you need to differentiate an appeal to an authority versus an appeal to an expert. So what's the difference between an expert and an authority? Now, some experts are authorities, some authorities are experts, but they have different meanings. What is it to be an authority versus what is it to be an expert?
I would say to be an expert, you have some kind of knowledge and field experience.
Yeah, expert is tied in with expertise. So to be an expert, you have to have a lot of knowledge to be a master of something. So, athletes are experts in the sport they play. You are all, I'm sure, experts at certain things in your life that I am not an expert in. What is an authority? What is it to be an authority? It's just about power. To be an authority figure is to be someone who has power over someone else. So be it power over someone else in a political sense, or in just like an emotional sense, or in like a school sense where one person has control over your grades, or it can also have a more metaphorical sense in which like LeBron James has incredible authority in the basketball world because he's so well respected that when he says something and he's so skilled, people listen to him. Donald Trump has authority because he has the ability to press a red button, which will blow up the whole world. So that's what we mean by authority. So the key here is to recognize that appeals to authority by themselves are not a good way of finding out if something's true. Appeals to experts are. If somebody is an expert in a certain field, but here's the problem. It's not always easy to tell the difference between an expert and an authority. For instance, how many people followed early on in COVID all the cures that people discovered? Do people remember what some of these were? I mean, there was the famous one that Trump was talking about that was just like, household bleach. Like, you want to drink some bleach? Like that was bleach was one of, that was coming from an authority, but that was not coming from an expert. On the flip side, you can have people who have an expertise in something and are worth talking to, even if they live at home in their parents' basement and have no friends and never leave. Like they're not really an authority, but they are an expert on a topic. Yeah, Kobe says hydrochlorine, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, hydro, whatever it is. That was another one where people were saying, let's solve this. And the question at this point was, well, are the people who are telling me to do this, are they experts? Or there was those people in that like weird offshoot church who were claiming if you drank like liquid silver, that was gonna do so. There was like some liquid that was mixed with like small particles of silver. It's basically like that vodka that has gold flakes in it, but minus the vodka and minus the gold and plus silver. And that's what they were claiming was like, this is gonna solve all your problems. Everyone, silver only works with werewolves. Remember that. So that's the idea here with authority. Now, this is the issue here because we need to rely on experts. We need in our everyday lives to go out. We can't know everything. The world is too big and complicated. There are many things. What are some things that you have to turn to an expert for? This is an excuse for me to drink some water. What are some things in your everyday life that you don't have expertise in, so you need to turn to an expert? Health advice, that's a really good one. If you have a pain in your ear, like inside your head, who do you talk to? You either go to a doctor or you go on WebMD and then learn inevitably, because anytime you go on WebMD, the answer is always cancer, that you have cancer. Don't ever look on WebMD if you don't want to stress out. Every single page on WebMD leads to cancer and you're just going to get scared. Yes, Eric, electrician, a plumber, a financial advisor, a lawyer. Like, I am not qualified to fix your house. Like, in some sense, and this is really the key of arguments from authority. If somebody is an authority figure, sometimes they're an authority figure because they have expertise. So, for instance, Ruth Bader Ginsburg made it to the Supreme Court in large part because she was an expert in the law. Therefore, she ended up as an authority figure. So very often authority figures make it there because they were experts, but not always, because people can become experts in other ways. And also, just as importantly, if you're an expert in one area, you're not going to be an expert in another. And this is a classic sort of issue that we have. So like, I, in some sense, am an authority figure over all of you because I have control over your grades. But because I'm an authority figure, do not let me fix the electricity in your house unless you really want to collect the insurance money. I'm not somebody you should ever let touch electrical appliances. So yeah, Eric, he says, is a king or a queen an example of a person who's an expert, not an expert, but in a position of authority? Yes, that is a really classic case. And this is part of the reason why monarchy was such a really crappy form of government. Like, you know, it doesn't make you qualified to rule people? Being born to somebody else. If you want, like, if you ever want, if you think Game of Thrones is crazy stories and all, just go back and read medieval history. It is just full of people who are completely unqualified for a job being put in charge of millions and hundreds of thousands and millions of people. I have a side interest in history and just some of the stories about like what people were up to. It's just like, you are not qualified for this. There was one French king who was convinced he was made out of glass and so wouldn't let anyone near him because he was going to get broken. If that is your mental state, you are not in a position to run a country, and yet this man was in charge of a country. Why? Because he happened to be born to the last French king. These are people with authority who are not experts, and therefore you don't want them making your decisions. Depending on your political views, there might be a certain somebody who you think is not really an expert who's in charge of many things right now and is thus an authority figure. But yeah, that's another one. And so part of the issue here is you need to think whenever you're trying to find a conclusion, you're almost always going to have to ask an expert of some sort unless it's something that you have expertise in. So the question is, in these sorts of arguments, the very fact that an authority figure told you alone is not enough to be a good argument. So you can think of it this way. And this goes back to our idea of hidden premises from a couple weeks ago. So here's the conclusion. I should drink bleach. What's your reason for this? Trump said so. Now, if Trump said so and leads to the conclusion I should drink bleach, hidden in here is this premise. Trump is an authority, so I should believe him. So when you say I should do it because Trump said so, in the background is this assumption that the fact that he said so gives you a reason to do it. And in many cases, this hidden premise is something that you need to point to and go, wait a second. That is not a good reason for it. And part of the reason that these arguments are so successful is because these premises are almost always hidden. And we listen just as a nature of human beings. We generally listen to people in positions of authority because, you know, very often someone in a position of authority has physical power. So, you know, if somebody has the power to beat you up, you listen to them, whatever they say. So when Trump comes along and says so, a lot of people are going to believe him. Or to take another case, you know, think about local television ads for like local, I don't know how many, I mean, I'm sure we've seen it. It's a local television ad where like Steve's Auto Repair Shop in Brooklyn is getting like a celebrity spokesperson. So they get like the third string quarterback for the New York Giants to come and like give a little spiel, or they'll get like, you know, they'll get an athlete who cannot act at all. And they'll be like, you know, Eli Manning says, eat our sandwiches. And it's just like, well, in the background is this thing like Eli Manning is an expert in sandwiches. And the moment you bring it out to the open, you're like, okay, so I should eat this sandwich because Eli Manning said so. Why? Well, in the background is this assumption that Eli Manning is an expert on sandwiches, or he's an authority figure, so I should believe him. And the moment you bring it out into the light, you're like, wait a second, that is a terrible reason. The fact that Eli Manning is saying this is not a good reason for me to buy this sandwich. In fact, why is Eli Manning saying to eat this sandwich? Does Eli Manning like this sandwich? What's the actual reason he's eating this sandwich and then getting on a commercial to tell you about it?
Good.
Say that again.
I didn't know my mic was on.
Oh, no worries. Why does... Yeah, so this is another one. And I'm going to come to this one in a second, Jaylene, because this is another really important one, especially in the modern world. But basically, why does Eli Manning tell you to eat that sandwich? Because someone gave him like $10,000 to show up on a commercial for 10 minutes. So Jaylene just said, what about when people started eating Tide Pods because someone on social media said they were delicious? So here is a really classic case of an appeal to authority going wrong. And here's the issue is on the internet, you don't know who anybody is. And so very often what you end up doing, also when you say I read it on the internet, it makes it sound really proper. Because like the internet is this place where all information comes from and you can find out whatever you need. Well, you know what else is on the internet? Mostly crap. It's cat videos and it's crap. But if you read it on the internet, the thought is like, oh, somebody said this. And then all of a sudden somebody comes along and is like, oh yeah, I read on this place that I should eat Tide Pods. And if I read that, somebody must have thought it's good to eat Tide Pods. And then the next thing you know, we have the Tide Pod challenge. People know what I'm talking about with the Tide Pod challenge, which I don't really think it's so much a challenge as just like somebody reads it's like an internet meme to poison yourself is basically what the Tide Pod challenge is. Those little like, this is laundry detergent in a pod form. I mean, granted, it does look kind of appealing. Like it's got like it looks like a gusher or like a gummy in some ways. So I guess I can understand why a child would eat it. But you know, you read it on the internet, and very often appeal to authority is I read it on the internet. And here's another, and this is kind of stepping outside of just generally with appeals to authority and more talking about in our everyday life. It's very easy on the internet to make things look like they're coming from an authority figure when they're not. So, not everyone these days is trusting the news, but still generally there are certain news sites that everybody trusts. And all you have to do to get somebody to believe you is just put something on a news site that looks like a news page. Like if you give it a fancy header and you make it look like a news story, very often your brain kicks in and is like, oh, this must be a true story. This must be an appeal to authority. So like a classic case is every couple of years, somebody comes along, some politician comes along and gets really worked up about something that they read about in a news story from The Onion. Do people know what The Onion is? Yeah, The Onion is like a fake satire newspaper. So it has stories like, I'm trying to think of ones that I can say that are like very, they're generally very, they're confrontational, a lot of them. So I'm trying to think of ones that are like they're very often like borderline not PC, but they're very often trying to make a statement about something. So they can be things like, I remember there was one that was started a few years ago that a Republican politician got really upset and went to Congress saying you couldn't allow, they had wrote this fake story about an abortion plex, which was a combination abortion clinic and amusement park, which is clearly far-fetched. But somebody read this story and was like, well, it said it in this newspaper, The Onion, therefore it's got to be true, therefore I have to go to Congress and complain about this abortion complex that's set up somewhere, when it was clearly fake. And this is a way in which, if you're not on the lookout for making sure that the authorities you're reading about are really experts or are really authority figures, you are going to get tricked into things. So this is basically how the internet gets us to buy things. It presents us as an authority figure because we know there's lots of true stuff on the internet. We know that there are a lot of good research articles and good news stories, but in amongst them is a lot of crap. And so if you present people like, oh, I'm an authority figure saying this, and that person wants to believe it, then very often they're going to end up believing it, and their justification is going to be the authority figure who doesn't really exist is this way. I mean, appeal to authority, or like tied in with this, you know, catfishing is kind of a related topic on this one. What's catfishing?
Pretending to be someone that they're not.
Yeah, so on catfishing on the internet, it's just you go on the internet and you pretend to be someone you aren't. So it's very often, you know, one person who's, it's usually done kind of as like a practical joke, and sometimes it goes very off the rails. Very often it's one person pretending to be another person to engage in a relationship with a different person. And this sort of thing is because it's on the internet and a person says they are somebody who they say they are and you want to believe it, people end up getting into these sorts of situations. So if you're going to appeal to an expert, how is it that you should go about deciding which experts to believe? Or how should you go about picking an expert? What are certain sorts of ways that you can avoid making this fallacy? How can you ensure that when you are appealing to another person as your evidence, the one you're appealing to is a good one? And this is just literally a practical question of like, what are some ways to do it? There's not a right answer here. There are a million right answers and a million wrong answers and no set thing. So what are some ways to ensure that, especially with the internet, you are actually listening to real experts? And this is literally just practical how not to be duped on the internet 101. All right, let me ask it in a different wording. We know that we have to ask other people for justification for us to reach certain conclusions. For instance, if you want to, your toilet starts leaking, you're gonna have to go to, unless you're like a super plumber yourself, which I am not, you're gonna have to go to a plumber. And this plumber is gonna say, you know what, you need a new toilet in here. How can you make sure, or what way can you make sure that you are, to the best of your ability, avoiding an appeal to authority, but still engaging and getting the information you need?
By researching.
Yeah, researching. So here's one thing to always do before you just go about blindly trusting experts is look up who they are. And I mean, one nice thing about the internet these days is with things like Yelp, you can like, before you ever get an appliance person in, just look on Yelp for it. Unfortunately, you know, living in apartment buildings, we often just get stuck with the super that we're handed. And very often they aren't an expert. They just happen to be somebody who needed a job and knew the building owner. But that's the sort of thing. Research who these people are. And also, if something seems too good to be true, it generally is too good to be true. Like, if you, I mean, the classic case is, you know, you get an email from someone that's like, you've won X many dollars, just give me your social security number. Like, that's too good to be true. These are the sorts of things to keep your mind out for. And on the internet, always look at where you're getting your information from. Just because it's given to you and you like it doesn't mean it's true. Which ties in with another element with appeals to authority. What's so tough with this is, this is just a fact about human beings. How many people have heard of confirmation bias? Have you heard of this? Let me write it down. We're kind of just going off the rails right now, but this is important, just stuff about how human beings work. Confirm. Any takers on confirmation bias?
Isn't that when you like already believe something and then you read something and you're like, oh, that agrees with
Yeah.
what I already believed, so it must be right.
That's exactly right, Kobe. The idea is with confirmation bias is you are biased towards things that already agree with what you believe. So if you watched the presidential debate the other night and you went into it thinking Trump was an idiot, everything Trump did up there is just going to add more confirmation to that fact. If you went up there and believed that Trump is a strong man who America needs right now, then when he got up there, he proved to you that he was a strong man who's going to lead America to greatness. And so that's what we mean by confirmation bias. And very often, the way that confirmation bias strikes is if you present someone with something that they agree with already, they're not going to look over it very closely. They're just going to read it and accept it. And if somebody gives you something you disagree with, you're going to read it very, very closely and do all that. So how does this tie into appeals to authority? Well, very often we take people to be experts because, not because we have any background evidence that they are an expert, but because they're saying things which we agree with. So therefore, we're tempted to just assume it's an expert to begin with. So another thing to be aware of is just like, don't because somebody claims they're an expert and they say something which sounds pretty good to you, don't necessarily assume that they really are an expert. So for instance, if I don't want to have to spend money on a new toilet and I have someone come in who's holding a plunger and says, yeah, you don't need a new toilet, I'm probably not going to put in much effort to look up whether this person knows what the hell they're talking about. If they come in and say, you definitely need a new toilet, then I might do a little more research and be like, do I really need a new toilet? I might get a second opinion. So in that case, you may have been a little too cautious about checking it. But it's kind of a back and forth with expertise and authority. It's just, you always have to ask yourself, what is this person an expert in and why are they an authority? Another thing to make sure is, because the worst evidence that someone says that someone's an expert is that they say they're an expert. Very often you don't want a person saying they're an expert. You want an outside source telling you they're an expert, because very often what you're going to end up people doing is, this is how cults work. How does a cult work? Well, first off, what's a cult? Not a cult, not like the horse. I mean cult, like C-U-L-T. Just what is a cult?
It's like a group of people following a charismatic leader who takes advantage of them. I don't know.
Yeah.
Something to that effect.
Yeah, that's spot on, Megan. The idea is that it's a group of people. It's almost always a very enclosed group of people who only interact with other people in this group. And very often they have very extreme beliefs. And those very extreme beliefs are about things that usually the cult leader is like an individual person who has the ability to talk to the higher power, knows God's plan, or has talked to the aliens. And because they claim to have this expertise that only they can know, people end up following them. And so when appeals to authority go wrong, cults are a very good case of this. It's a case in which somebody's claiming to be an authority, and then other people follow them and believe that they're an authority without ever pausing to say, what evidence is there that this person is an authority? Another thing to keep your eye out for is watching out for people who claim to be authorities on things that there's no way of proving whether they're right or wrong. So for instance, if somebody claims they're an expert plumber, if I say I'm a plumbing expert, you should believe me. What's a really quick way of proving whether I'm lying or not? What's the quickest way of telling whether I'm a good plumber or not? If I say I'm a good plumber, how can you put me to the test?
Question you?
I can question me. So that's one thing, is I can tell you all sorts of stuff. But say I read really well on the WikiHow of how to plunge and how to be I can recite the WikiHow page. What's another way of testing whether I'd be a good plumber?
By making him actually do the work.
Yeah, put me in a place where I have to do some plumbing. And if I can do some plumbing, then that's proof that I'm a plumber. If you tell me my toilet's clogged and I come in and I unclog that toilet, that's proof that I know what the hell I'm talking about. So the tough thing is, watch out for authority figures who claim to know, but there's no way of testing them. So in a cult, how do you test whether the cult leader has actually spoken to the higher being? There's not really part of the whole idea of the cult is you have nothing to go on except the person's word. So in any sort of case in which someone says, I'm an expert in this thing, always try to find out, is this the sort of thing I can prove someone's an expert in? And this is another way of, horoscopes are very often like this. Horoscopes give you this illusion that they're an expert in something by very often they're just making grand claims, like something bad will sometime happen to you. It doesn't take a genius to know that at some point in your life, something bad will happen. That's just life. Now, I do think that very often people who claim to have certain powers have some sort of ability to read people. There's definitely a really good psychic or a good magician is really good at manipulating your attention and picking up on signals. But I don't necessarily think that if you can't prove that they're reading your mind, it's very difficult to figure out, is this person an expert? Is this person really a mind reader? Or is it just that they're Sherlock Holmes-esque and very observant, and human beings give off all sorts of nonverbal signals? So this is just something to keep in mind, is just when you're trying to figure out the truth of something, very often you're going to have to ask other people, but very often those other people are not going to be good sources. So make sure, another things, you know, and this is just, it's weird that I'm up here giving common sense, where I'm sure some of you are just like zoned off because it's like, yeah. Jaylee says like David Blaine the magician. Yeah, magicians are incredible at getting your attention. They convince you that that they're an expert in actual magic, when really what they're good at is just like they understand human psychology very well. So if you ever want to, I've recently discovered a new hobby, which is watch magic tricks on YouTube at 0.25 speed and just observe the way in which you can see the trick happening much more easily. Like when somebody makes a ball appear out of a cup and all that stuff, you can, if you're moving it at 0.25 speed, you can see how they're doing it. But you can also realize the genius of the way that they control your attention and your emotions, so that at normal speed, you have no idea what they're doing. It's almost always they'll hold like a hand up here. So when they do something down here, you don't realize it, because what's happening down here is like, you know, tricky. But because they're doing something exciting up here, you're not paying attention because they know that human beings look to certain spots. So those are experts. But another thing is knowing what they're actually an expert in. So, you know, David Blaine the magician is an expert at psychology and attention. He's not an expert at actual magic. He couldn't get into Hogwarts. That would not work. So these are the things to keep in mind. And also, just because someone says they're an expert or someone's an authority figure in one area, don't listen to them in every area. You know, if they're not a doctor, don't ask them for medical advice. And another thing is, very often there are sub-disciplines that you have to, before you can identify an expert, an unfortunate fact is you need to do some research of your own. So like if I have a pain in my foot, I first need to look up what doctor to look for. Like I can't go into like the cardiologist and be like, doctor, I have like a pain in my big toe, because the cardiologist works on hearts. So you have to know a little bit about the thing you want to ask the question in before you can even identify the experts. All right. So that was Common Sense 101 on how to, you know, pick a good expert when you are trying to find out what you need to do. We might not get through all of these today, which is fine because we have next class to talk about the other fallacies. So that's what an appeal to authority. What is an ad hominem argument? It's saying you shouldn't believe this, or you should believe this because what? I'll give you a clue. It was all over the presidential debate, or any time you see Donald Trump have an argument with anybody. What is Donald Trump's go-to way in the presidential debates of engaging with his opponents?
Personal attack?
Yeah, personal attack. An ad hominem argument is the fancy way of making a personal attack on someone. So instead of saying something like, Chuck Schumer's political view or taxation views are bad, he just says, you know, you can't listen to crying Chuck Schumer. Or, you know, Lion Nancy, you can't trust Lion Nancy. These are ways in which you attack somebody's as a person instead of attacking their views. So if you're trying to say like, I believe that universal health care is good, and somebody wants to argue against me, a good argument against universal health care would be something like the cost to the country would be such that it would, Keisha said Sleepy Joe. Yeah, Sleepy Joe's another one. These are the sorts of arguments that Trump goes with. You just give people names. Why? Because if you give someone a name, you don't have to engage with this. If you tell me, I say universal health care is good and we should have it, somebody else comes along and says the cost to the American public will be too high, taxes will have to go up too much. Those are good reasons of engaging with it. Saying, Professor, you're smelly and you're stupid. Or like you don't have good taste in dogs and your clothes are ugly. That's not good reason to think that universal health care is a bad thing. What does this do? It pulls the attention away from the fact that you aren't an expert in something. So part of the genius here of using these personal attacks is that they pull people away from the real issue. So if, however, someone is making a personal attack and it's a successful personal attack, and even if what they're saying is true, it doesn't mean that what they said is false. So for instance, when Trump calls Joe Biden Sleepy Joe Biden, like it might well be the case that Joe Biden is sleepy. Like he might actually be a sleepy fellow. But whether that's true or not has nothing to do with whether Joe Biden will has a good view about healthcare or he has a good view about taxes. What Trump is doing there is drawing the attention away. So if you find yourself drawn by these arguments, you're making some sort of fallacy. And like, let's be clear, it's really fun to watch personal attacks. It is enjoyable to do. There's a reason why people do it. Like roasts are a thing where one person stands up and then everyone else makes fun of them. That is enjoyable. Why is like insult comedy such a big aspect of comedy? Because it's fun. But just because somebody's insulting doesn't mean they're getting you to a good conclusion. So there's a very important difference between saying something that is funny and grabs your attention and getting to the truth. And so if you think, like, I'm going to be honest, putting my cards on the table, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump by any means. But I will say, watching him get on a debate stage and insulting people and the strange nicknames he comes up with, like watching him say little Marco Rubio was really entertaining. Like that was just like a thing. It's like, this man is getting really upset when this other man is making fun of him. Like, I'm sorry, I'm enjoying this. But just because of that doesn't mean that somebody's qualified. Like all this shows, if somebody's good at personal attacks, it shows they're really good at being a comedian. And that shows their qualification. But that doesn't mean that ad hominem attacks, you shouldn't be pulled in by them. Try to stay above the entertainment level. Try to stay above all that stuff and concentrate on the crux. If you're trying to decide who to be for president, like who to vote for president, the substance of the views is far more important. Because the fact that somebody can say funny jokes or come up with clever nicknames is in no way qualifying them to be president. Now, on the flip side, there's another type of argument which is related to an ad hominem argument, which actually is a good argument. And this is just calling into account credentials. And this is a subtle, interesting sort of situation where when you call someone's credentials into effect, you're not attacking them as a person in irrelevant ways. You're pointing to facts about them that are directly relevant for the topic at hand. So for instance, if I'm giving you a lecture on logic or giving you a lecture on history, whether I'm wearing a button shirt or not shouldn't necessarily make a difference for whether I know anything about like the English monarchy in the 1200s. Probably most of you other than me don't have an interest in this, but if you did and you were listening to this lecture, what I looked like shouldn't matter. However, so if you said, we don't listen to Professor, he dresses funny and smells bad, that wouldn't be a good reason not to listen to me. Now though, there are certain sorts of questions where the way I dress and how I smell are a good sign that you shouldn't listen to me. What are some situations in which like the fact that I smell bad and the fact that my clothes look like crap are good evidence that you shouldn't listen to me? Where is it that it goes from just an ad hominem attack to an attack of my credentials?
I think if you were trying to advertise like soap or clothing line, maybe.
If I'm like, look, I got the best bar of soap. I made it myself in the back. And you're like, oh my God, Professor's giving us soap advice and he smells terrible. And your reason for not using my soap is I smell bad. The fact that I smell bad is directly relevant in this case. So another one is like with fashion. How many of you have watched Queer Eye? Anybody other than me watch Queer Eye? It's the show in which the 5 gay men help people make of their lives. Yeah. So here's the thing. The guy who's in charge of fashion is incredibly well dressed. And if you had me on that show, I would not be qualified. And the fact that he's well dressed is a sign that he's someone you should trust about fashion. And yes, tan friends. Also, I saw him in a Levi's in Soho once. His hair is even better in person. That's all I'm gonna say on that topic. But yeah, so you trust Tan. If Tan started wearing like trench coats and plastic bags, like you wouldn't trust him. He would get fired from the show. And so in the same way, ad hominem attacks cease being ad hominem attacks when they become relevant. And so part of the genius of Trump's ad hominem attacks is that he brings up attacks which somehow seem relevant to the credentials of the person. So for instance, you call someone Sleepy Joe Biden, then there's somehow what that manages to do is it makes people think like, well, is he gonna sleep on the job too? Is this somebody we can't trust? Or you say like crying Chuck Schumer, like, haha, it's an ad hominem attack. But you say like, do you really need a politician who's gonna cry? Like it starts to mess with people's heads. And so with ad hominem attacks, the key is to recognize the line between it being a genuine ad hominem, stupid side argument where it has totally irrelevant, and ones in which the things you're bringing up are tied into a person's credentials. So for instance, I would never trust Eli Manning to choose my sandwiches. And if I tell you that you shouldn't trust him because he's smelly, well, that's not a good reason not to trust him. The reason not to trust him is because he's not an expert. But if you tell me I shouldn't trust Eli Manning in his soap buying products because he's smelly, that becomes relevant again. So the way to just keep in mind is ad hominem attacks are really good at grabbing your attention and keeping you focused. In a lot of ways, an ad hominem attack is like those David Blaine magic tricks. It keeps your attention up here on all the yelling and lets the magician do whatever they want down here. And that's, part of the genius of ad hominem attacks by politicians is they can then do all sorts of things that don't end up benefiting the average person. But if they keep saying stuff up here, nobody notices. So that's what an ad hominem is, and trying to keep in mind when is it ad hominem and when is it questioning my credentials. If you say, we can't trust him, he's from Missouri. Like, okay, that's actually like an insult. That's just an ad hominem attack, unless the question is, how do you get from Grand Central to Penn Station? Then the fact that someone's from Missouri is no longer an ad hominem attack. It's pointing out a reason you shouldn't trust them for Manhattan directions. So those are the first two types of mistakes. The next one is straw man. I think what do we have, 10 minutes left? 10 minutes? All right, let's do straw man and then we'll finish. What is a straw person? Literally, like, what is and I don't mean like in the argument sense. I mean literally, what is a straw person?
Scarecrow?
Yeah, it's a scarecrow. Yeah, a scarecrow. And what is the point of a scarecrow? What is it designed to do?
To scare crows?
Exactly, yeah, it's in the name. It's designed to look like a person to scare crows. But outside of that movie, which why am I forgetting the name of The Wizard of Oz? Which I stand by being the most overrated movie in history. Hot take. Although the monkeys are pretty cool. I do wish I had a flying monkey. But hot take, Wizard of Oz is overrated. But that scarecrow is the only scarecrow that actually is a person. Most of the time, what a scarecrow or a straw man is something that looks like a person, but isn't really a person. In the same way, a straw man argument is you attack something. So here's the thing. If I were to try to prove to you Jeepers Creepers, another one. This is the one where we have scarecrows who are real people. But if I were to try to prove to you, I'm the biggest, strongest, most badass person in the world, I'm gonna beat the crap out of a human being, and then I just start punching the crap out of a scarecrow, is that gonna prove to you that I'm big and tough? No. If you're at a distance, it might look like if I'm doing spinning roundhouse kicks on a scarecrow, and you just see me from across a field, you might be like, oh, that's Chuck Norris right there. That person knows how to beat people up. But if you see me up close, it's you're not attacking anything worthwhile. That's the idea behind a straw man argument. What you do is you replace a view that somebody actually holds, which is subtle and interesting. You replace it with something simpler. You'll replace it with a straw man, and then you attack the straw man to prove how good your argument is. So an example of a straw man argument is politics are like the endless supply of great crappy arguments. So a straw man argument is one in which somebody comes along and says, there are very often straw man arguments by right-wing politicians against someone like Bernie Sanders. So the argument will be like, don't vote for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is going to take all your possessions away and you're going to live in a hole in the ground because everything is going to be communist. It's like, well, that's a real, like, yeah, you're right. I don't want to live in a hole in the ground with no products. You're right. If you don't, so the argument will go something like, step one, Bernie Sanders says communism is great and we're going to tax all of your possessions and you're not going to own anything. You don't want that, do you? Therefore, don't vote for Bernie Sanders. So therefore, in this argument, though, Bernie Sanders doesn't believe that you should live in a hole in the ground and have no possessions. That's a straw man version of Bernie Sanders. Another one is a case in which, you know, when people were saying things, you can think of cases in which Democrats on the flip side, they'll be like, look, Donald Trump's going to send us into nuclear war immediately. Like Donald Trump said he's going to bomb North Korea. It's like, therefore you should believe that you don't want to bomb North Korea because they're going to bomb us back, right? Therefore, don't vote for Donald Trump. Now, I think there are many good reasons not to vote for Donald Trump, but the fact that he's going to tomorrow blow up North Korea and they're going to blow us up back, I mean, it's not necessarily a good argument. Nobody's coming out and saying Donald Trump did not come out and be like, I'm definitely going to nuke North Korea tomorrow. To say that that's why you shouldn't vote for him, that's another straw man. So a straw man is you just take a reasonable argument and you say, you then take it, you make an extreme version, and then you prove the extreme version's wrong. To prove that, like, showing that you don't want to live in a hole in the ground doesn't prove that Bernie Sanders would be a bad president. The fact is, Bernie Sanders never said you should live in a hole in the ground. The fact that you prove that doesn't actually attack his position. What you do is you make it more extreme and attack that one, and it draws away from what the actual positions are. So that's how a straw man argument works. Other ones you can think of are, you know, trying to think. They're generally so over the top they can be difficult to think of. Like, well, very often you take a particular example and then show, like, assume that they're all like that and then say something extreme. So it'd be like, Donald Trump said, or let me think of a good one here. Hillary Clinton said we should allow immigrants into the country. Well, all immigrants are terrorists. So, Hillary Clinton loves terrorists. Do you love terrorists? Well, if you don't love terrorists, vote for Trump. That sort of thing is a straw man argument. Hillary Clinton never said she loved terrorists. She just said, I'm open to having legal means for immigration in this country. That right there is not a sign of you love letting terrorists into the country. Here's another one is a classic one is something along the lines of Hillary Clinton said we should let in terrorists, or Joe Biden believes terrorists should be allowed into the United States. That's not what Joe Biden said. What Joe Biden said is we should allow legal immigration. But the straw man version is, yay, terrorists. That's a straw man argument. It's just take something reasonable, run it to an extreme, then prove the extreme is wrong, and therefore the person who holds the much more reasonable view. Why is it a mistake? Because nobody believes the straw man version. In the same way that the fact that I can spinning roundhouse kick the head off of a scarecrow doesn't show you that I'm the best, like, kung fu fighter in the world. Like, showing that I can beat up a straw man doesn't show that I have any idea what I'm talking about in a certain area. The fact that Trump can disprove somebody, nobody said we should take all money away from everybody. But if you show that that's a bad argument, sometimes you can get that to believe that, like, oh my God, they're a communist who's going to steal everything, and therefore we can't vote for them. So that's a straw man. All right, I'm tired out of speaking about these things, and we don't have enough time to jump into these. So next time we'll talk about false dilemma and two wrongs not making a right. But that was it for this time, and I will see you all next week. Have a good one.
You too, Professor.
Have a great day.